Kia ora, no, you're with Breakfast. Now, the election may be just around the corner, but are we as informed on our political parties as we should be? For example, could you confidently say off the top of your head who our Minister for the Environment is?
David Parker.
If you can't, don't feel too bad, because only 1 in 20 of us know it's David Parker.
Is it David Parker?
New research out this morning shows there are wide gaps in the public's understanding of our political and civic institutions. And to explain this further, we're joined by co-author of Democracy in the Dark, Dr. Eric Crampton. Morena, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning.
Okay, so let's talk civics first. We certainly didn't study civics at our school. The conversations around politics were very rare in our home. So for those like me, a quick 101 on civics. What is it and what does it encompass?
Well, civics basically covers how government is formed, the electoral system that gets you there, how governments make decisions, how powers are separated and check each other, and then how policy comes out of that process. So basically how political decisions get made, all the way up from voting through to Parliament enacting the laws and the judiciary then interpreting them if it comes into weird edge cases. But civic knowledge in New Zealand is remarkably poor.
Yes, so let's talk about that survey, but let's talk first about the protocols. So how was it conducted and who were the participants?
Oh, sure. We had it was a random stratified sample of 1,000 New Zealanders. We hired one of the polling companies to ask the questions for us.
Okay, so let's talk about those results then.
Yes.
What were you surprised about, or were you surprised about the gaps in our understanding, our lack of some very basic knowledge about, for example, how MMP works?
Yeah, I wasn't particularly surprised about that one because I've been paying attention to the literature around voter knowledge for a long time. I used to be an academic at Canterbury University. That was kind of my thing when I was there. Wave after wave of the New Zealand election survey has shown that about half of voters really don't understand how MMP works. They don't understand that there's two ways that parties can enter Parliament. So I wasn't particularly surprised to see that in our survey, again, less than half of voters understood that you can get into Parliament either by winning a seat or by getting 5% of the vote.
So if that didn't surprise you, what did surprise you?
Oh, I was surprised that only about 1 in 5 respondents knew the parties that had voted in favor of the zero carbon bill. It was one of the huge legislative set pieces last year. Nationals turned to supporting it, got a lot of coverage. It was kind of a big move for National. There was a lot of debate about whether they'd support it or whether they wouldn't, and then they wound up supporting it. And only, I think it was 22% of respondents could accurately name all of the parties that had supported it. And that gets to be a problem, right? If democratic accountability fundamentally requires being able to punish or reward the parties that do the things that you think are the right thing, knowing which parties have done what kind of matters. It was disappointing as well that just under 70% of Kiwis could identify all of the parties that are in Parliament. Yeah. In prior work, looking at New Zealand election survey, something like 16% of voters in 2008 and 17% in 2005 could not even identify that Labour was the dominant member of the governing coalition going into the election. Like a fundamental bedrock for democratic accountability. If you know nothing else about how the system works, you should be able to look out of the window. If things look good, vote for the incumbent. If things look bad, vote against the incumbent. But that requires knowing who the incumbent is. And just under a fifth of voters have trouble with that.
Now, and also note in the report, which I found really fascinating, and to be true, you point out that the lack of importance placed on casting an informed vote, the attention instead is placed on our civic duty to vote and having conversations with people around that. That's absolutely right. They're saying, yes, you should vote. However, where is the emphasis on placing an informed vote, right?
Yeah, I strongly sympathize with that. Michael Huemer is a political philosopher that I like. He has a whole book on this, that there might not be a duty to vote, but if you vote, you have a duty to vote well. You can kind of think about it as almost like tailpipe emissions, right? If I go out driving, my driving contributes a tiny, tiny, tiny bit to global warming. At least we have an ETS, but added all up together across the whole world, it's a big problem. If you go into the ballot box and you're very poorly informed, your ballot has a tiny, 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 tiny chance of changing the outcome, and that's why you don't bother becoming that informed to start with. But when you add up all of those together, these voter-on-voter externalities add up to a lot, and they get us to worse policies than we should have.
In 10 seconds, how do we fix it?
I think we need to have stronger incentives to become informed. We can try having better civics education in the schools through an experimental approach to see if it works, but I think we need to try things that are a little bit more radical, looking at things like Electoral Commission phoning people up, have a set of questions that are published in the newspaper weekly, basics on civics. If you're today's lucky caller, $10,000 if you get the answer right. It wouldn't cost very much to run the experiment. It'd be $3.65 million a year, right, in prize money. But imagine getting the call, not knowing the answer, even though it was in the paper that morning, and then having to turn to your partner and saying, you know what, I just cost us $10,000 because I couldn't remember who the government is.
I like your style, Dr. Eric Crampton. Thank you so much for your time this morning, co-author of Democracy in the Dark. Oh, just before you go, that
Yes.
test, where can we find it?
The quiz questions are all in the report, and I think that the Herald was looking to be running an interactive version of it as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I think I might need to take it.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I thought Dr. Crampton made his point really compellingly. And you know, I was hanging on every word. I mean, I thought that was a wonderful interview. I really enjoyed it. And I think there is a challenge to us to know a great deal, but there is also a sense in parts of the population that politics has left them behind, that they feel so marginalised, so ignored, so excluded. And so there has to be a reciprocity, doesn't there?
And part of that too is if that conversation isn't part of your everyday life, like it wasn't in my home. Mum and Dad were out working most of the time. I'd get home, you'd look after yourself. So those conversations never happened. It was never part of my fabric of when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's because I do what I do now that you have more of an interest and understanding in things.
Yeah.
However, if, you know, on a day-to-day basis...
You're struggling to pay the rent.
Totally.
You can't eat a warrant of fitness. And what Dr. Crampton would say is, well, vote for the party that's going to change that. But actually, if you're just treading water, you're not looking beyond the wave that's about to slap you in the face.
Which is why he's talking about putting it into schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was good. I really enjoyed that chat.